Hello, everyone. Today we are talking about how the Biden administration and the CDC are potentially going to be going after gun control. Now, there's an article that was written and posted by CNN that talks with the head of the CDC and how they are planning to once again look at gun violence. There's some stuff in here that I want to critique, and then there's a few things that, maybe it's not as bad as it might seem at first, but we also have to be aware of the fact that they are always going to be trying to come after your ability to protect yourself, especially from the government. So let's all keep that in mind when we start talking about some of the information that we see in this article. Now, before we get going into this article titled Something Has to Be Done, I do want to say thank you to everyone that supports this channel. I really got to say thank you to Route 66 Shooting Sport Park for helping me so much in the past. They were a little bit scared for a second about some fires that were in the area, but they're still up and kicking. I'm very thankful to have their support. And if you want to support the channel, you can either just drop a like, comment, share this video somewhere, or use any of the affiliate links down in the description below. Some of them will give you discounts on some really awesome products. So here's the title. Something has to be done. After decades of near silence from the CDC, the agency's director is speaking up about gun violence. I wonder why they were silent for so long. We'll get into that. Something has to be done about this, CDC Director Walensky said in an exclusive interview with CNN. Now is the time. It's pedal to the metal time. This summer alone has been a spree of gun injuries and deaths, and the weekends have been especially violent, with an average of 200 people killed and 472 injured by guns each weekend in the United States, not including suicides, according to analysis done by the Gun Violence Archive for CNN. Great source. That's nearly 3.4 people shot every hour every weekend. Now, you always got to be very critical when you see the Gun Violence Archive being the source of anything. Gun control advocacy groups and statistics are commonly used in ways that enforce their agenda and don't really always have accurate information to work with. It's definitely, in my opinion, better to use the FBI statistics on crime because it's generally going to be more accurate and it looks at things a little bit later down the road to kind of make sure the information they're talking about is accurate. Not calling a school shooting an incident where someone had a BB gun on campus and fired a round into the air, because it's not necessarily a school shooting. But what do I know? The scope of the problem is just bigger than we're even hearing about, and when our heart wrenches every day you turn on the news, you're only hearing the tip of the iceberg, Walensky said. We haven't spent the time, energy, and frankly the resources to understand the problem because it's been so divided. Here's the problem. The reason you see it on the news and you hear about these terrible things all the time is because the media and the news feeds off anger, aggression, and fear. They are trying to make you afraid to get you to do whatever it is that their agenda lines up with. So you might think that America is way more violent and dangerous than it's ever been, but in reality, we've been seeing pretty steady declines in overall violence rates for like 60-something years. So keep in mind that most violence is in a very few select areas, and violence in general is declining. So don't live your life in fear, I guess, is the statement that I'd like to make about that. The last sitting CDC director to make strong public statements about gun violence was Dr. David Satcher, who served on the position from 1993 to 1998. Now, the problem is when you have the head director of the CDC saying that they believe in gun control and are trying to manipulate data and generate data for their cause of removing your rights to defend yourself and have the tools and the arms to protect yourself, that's a bit of a problem, and that is actually why the NRA, being a powerful lobbying force in Washington, now I put that in air quotes because nowadays we don't really think that so much, but the media still does, and fearing congressional budget cuts under the NRA pressure, former CDC directors for decades were all but silent on gun violence, even as guns killed tens of thousands of Americans a year. Even as guns killed tens of thousands of Americans a year. Now, my guns must be pretty goddamn lazy because my guns have not killed anyone yet, so I guess somebody's guns are out there working 160 hours of overtime every week. Satcher said Walensky was brave for speaking out. here's the deal. The reason why the CDC was cut from being able to look into gun violence and study it was because you had someone who was so opposed to gun ownership that it created a branch of the government or an government organization that was being used for gun control for their own purposes and agenda. So maybe that might have something to do with it. Now, here we got to talk about this. In April, President Joe Biden said the country was facing a gun violence public health epidemic, but the CDC hasn't said how it plans to address the epidemic till now. Yep, this is the target. This is the way they're going to be going. You see things like, people comment on videos when I talk about, weed and guns, and this guy was smoking weed and now his gun rights are gone. Things like FPS Russia. And people say, you should have just followed the law. You should have just not been a prohibited person. Well, what's prohibited person today versus what's prohibited person a few years down the road, that might sound like I'm making some sort of slippery slope fallacy, but they are actively targeting and trying to make it a public health epidemic. Now, what do you think his goal is? Do you think it's actually safety for all people? Or do you think that he's trying to declare a gun violence, a public health epidemic, so that then they can add to who is a prohibited person and who they can prevent from having the legal means to accessing the ability to protect themselves? It's not that slippery of a slope fallacy. It's not a slippery slope fallacy when it is a roller coaster ride that we've been watching the whole way. We know what's going down. We know what's happening. You know that it's going to go over here. That's just how it works. So then it talks about how some of the spending that they're going on now is going to be going into 18 research projects to prevent gun-related violence and injuries. And me personally, I don't necessarily have a problem with the government spending money in the intent of making people safe or understanding where violence occurs, but the problem is really with me how it's being done. And we know for the fact that there are certain areas in America which attribute to almost all of the violence and all of the crime. So when you're looking at things and putting projects in that are studying everything nationwide, I don't think you can't really look at America, how big and diverse it is, and take a single piece of information and say, yep, that's how it's going to work in, Spokane, and how it's going to work in Detroit, and how it's going to work in every city in Alabama or Montana. It's just, you can't really generally say that it's going to work the same ways. So I think that it's more of local issues instead of nationwide problems, because if you were to take out, I think, like the top 5 most violent cities, the crime rates would be almost nothing. But again, their intent is to understand who and how people are being injured, because I guess data is power and information is power, so that is interesting. Now, then it goes on, another project in Vermont educates children about how to safely use and store guns. According to a 2015 study, an estimated 7% of U.S. children, or 4.6 million at the time, lived with at least one loaded and unlocked gun. I'd love to see the information about this study, and I'll probably skim through this in a later date, because usually when they do these studies and say U.S. children, they include anyone under the age of 18. Now, how many of you, I'd like to hear down in the comments below, how many of you shot a gun before you were 18? How many of your parents let you have access to firearms prior to you being 18? Because 18, being an adult, doesn't necessarily mean that you're mature, and being a child doesn't necessarily mean that you're immature. I know 10-year-olds that I would be comfortable with having a gun loaded around me, and I know 20-year-olds who I would never fucking let near a gun that belonged to me. So it kind of just, it goes both ways. So I think that this is a piece of information that they're trying to use to scare people, but it is important to understand that unsecured firearms are a leading cause of children accidentally shooting themselves. So if you have children, you may want to, whether the law says to or not, you may want to analyze the situation that you live in and make a choice for yourself of how likely am I going to be in a situation where I need to use a firearm to defend myself versus how likely is one of my kids or one of my kids' friends going to accidentally stumble across this gun, and do I trust them with it? So those are the things you got to kind of weigh, because you never want to see a kid die because you incorrectly evaluated the situation and determined whether or not you should or shouldn't leave a loaded firearm around in a way that they could access it. So that's up to you to decide. Morally, the law in some municipalities has its own jurisdiction as far as what they say you are legally required to do. Now, it goes on to say the CDC once did these kinds of studies until 1997, when the NRA convinced Congress to cut all of the CDC's funding for gun research, a loss equivalent to millions of dollars a year. I'm fine with that, because at the time the CDC was trying to use gun control and trying to enforce their own gun control agendas with research. He goes on to then say how Donald Trump actually allowed the government to spend more money and give the CDC funding of $25 million split between the CDC and the US NIH. Interesting. Orange man bad. Walensky said that much of CDC's research will be engaged in understanding the root causes of gun violence. Now, this next few paragraphs that they quote her on, I am actually I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that their goal is not gun control, but I'm doubtful that it will not be used for gun control, if that makes sense. Maybe it doesn't make so much sense. I would like to believe that they are unbiased. However, I'm a realist, and I know that everybody has their own bias, and someone that's speaking out in such a way probably more likely than not has a lot of bias. Oftentimes, these will be escalating events that occur that might lead to a suicide or a homicide, and what we really need to do is understand the root causes of that. Again, understanding the root causes of the violence and going after those and targeting that as opposed to targeting gun rights, I'm all on board with that. The firearm injury is probably the most distal part of what happens. It's the end event. What are the 10, 12, 15 things where we could have intervened before that singular event? So you look at things like, our people growing up with stable parent relationships? Are people able to get a job? Are people able to do something without going to jail and then getting out of jail and then not being able to get a job because they came out of jail? There's all kinds of things that might happen where social programs that are giving people jobs or giving people skills that they can then use to maybe better themselves, things like that might have some sort of impact. Or where can we intervene? If kids are depressed, how can we prevent them from wanting to get to the point where they do something that lands them on national news? So, I don't know. It's just, there's many of things that could happen prior that can be used to improve the livelihoods of people without affecting their rights to keep and bear arms or access firearms, but then also stop people from getting to a point where they're mentally unstable and providing them the health care that they need. This whole next section talks about how a colleague of hers had a family member that was involved in a gun violence situation. And then Walensky then goes on to say, I'm not here about gun control. In restarting gun violence research, Walensky said that the CDC wants the CDC to find common ground with gun owners. Let's agree. We don't want people to die. Let's just agree there. What can we do to stop people from dying, and what can we do to stop people from being injured, she said. Walensky seems careful to avoid the ire of gun rights activists. She doesn't even like using the word gun, preferring the term firearm. Generally, the word gun, for those who are worried about research in this area, is followed by the word control. And that's not what I want to do here, she added. I'm not here about gun control. I'm here about preventing gun violence and gun deaths. That sounds great. The problem is I very much likely see her saying, hello, here's the information we've found. We've found X, Y, or Z risk factors that we can affect and help people improve their lives that would prevent them from having to do violence or being likely to do violence. And then the gun grabbers go, okay, so you're saying get rid of the guns. So that's really my thought process on it. She said she doesn't want people to think that she is trying to take away their guns. This is not a conversation about having them or not having them. I understand that her goal might be that, but the end result is likely going to be that. This is a conversation about how we can make them being here safe. The research that we intend to do is going to be squarely about making America safe, making people feel safe. Making people feel safe is a lot different than making people safe. And I think that's a big distinction that I want to make. A lot of people feel safe with the idea of gun control without actually thinking, is this actually going to make me safer? So I just want to critique that. She invited gun owners to be part of the solution. Come join the table, join us in the conversation. I want you to teach me what you have done to make your guns safe, and then I want you to teach everybody else, she added. Now, I want to skip ahead to a part where CNN reached out to the NRA to ask if it was willing to work with Walensky. A spokesperson for the NRA did not respond to CNN's request for comment. First of all, the NRA is kind of trash, but one of the best things that I think it does, that many people, including writers for CNN and all the other big publications, have criticized, is the Eddie Eagle program. The NRA has tried to have programs taught in schools where they teach kids to not like if they stumble across a gun, stop, don't touch, tell an adult, that kind of thing. And those programs are being criticized and forced out of schools because it's the NRA. The NRA does have a whole lot of programs out there to help improve the safety of firearms existing in the world, but people like this writer most likely would not want the NRA coming into their school and trying to actually make a difference and keeping them from hurting themselves, because that's a huge part of this accidental death, is when someone accidentally gains access to it and does something dumb. And those are a huge problem. And that's something that can very much be solved with proper education at a young age. But I don't think people would really want that. So looking at this article and kind of discussing it, I think that there's some potential promise in the fact that maybe the CDC director isn't a gun control advocate. I doubt it. And maybe the CDC won't present information that will then be used by the gun grabbers and the politicians who wish to enforce gun control to further their cause. I doubt it. I really think that they're going to use that information. So am I stoked about this? I would say no, because I know that it's going to end up being they're going to provide information, and then the solution that all of the Democrats that try to push for gun control is going to be get rid of the guns. And that's not actually going to be a problem. That's not actually going to be a solution to the problem, because it's not actually going to address the root cause of the problem. I'd love to hear what you guys think down below. I think that this was kind of interesting to see. We definitely know that the goal of them reclassifying gun violence as a public health epidemic is going to be because they want to enforce and create more gun control. It's got nothing to do with them actually giving a damn about any of you. It's entirely about being able to control you. Let me know what you think down below. You all know the drill. Have fun, be safe, stay dangerous. Peace.